the baby supposedly died during delivery, then why did the hospital remove her records completely instead of documenting the death normally? And why did the nurse suddenly look terrified the second the woman came back asking questions?
Your baby didn't make it. Dr. Hayes said it without sitting down, like he needed the words out before I could ask anything else. I remember trying to lift myself off the hospital bed, my hands shaking so badly the IV line snapped against the rail. "Can I see him?" I asked. The nurse beside him looked at the floor. Hayes didn't. "He was born with severe complications, Blanche." That should have sounded final. It didn't. Because while he was talking, Nurse Valerie slid a folder under her clipboard so fast I barely caught the label on the corner. Live delivery. Then she noticed me staring at it, and suddenly everyone in the room went quiet. Not shocked quiet, careful quiet, like I'd said something dangerous without realizing it. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Dr. Hayes stepped closer to the bed and lowered his voice. "You lost a significant amount of blood during surgery. Right now, you need rest, not stress." I remember staring at him, trying to process the sentence instead of the tone. He wasn't comforting me. He was managing me. "I just want to see my son." Valerie tightened her grip on the clipboard so hard the papers bent at the corners. Hayes sighed once, patient but cold. "Blanche, there's nothing to see." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. Nothing to see. Not him, not the nursery, not a photograph, nothing. The room smelled like antiseptic and overheated plastic from the monitors beside me. Somewhere down the hallway, another baby started crying. Instinctively, my body reacted before my brain did. I turned toward the sound. Hayes noticed. "He's gone," he said firmly this time. I looked back at Valerie. For half a second, I thought she might say something different. Her mouth even parted slightly like she was about to interrupt him. But she didn't. Instead, she pulled a stack of forms from beneath the clipboard and set them beside me. Discharge paperwork, sympathy release forms, a consent acknowledgement. I frowned at the page. Why would I sign discharge papers already? "You've been here 3 days, Hayes answered immediately. 3 days? That didn't make sense. The last thing I remembered was being rushed into surgery after my blood pressure crashed. I remembered bright operating lights, a mask over my face, someone yelling for more suction. 3 days were gone. "I want my phone," I said. Valerie hesitated before handing it to me from the cabinet drawer. The battery was dead. When I asked for a charger, Hayes checked his watch first, like he had somewhere more important to be. "You should contact someone to pick you up." There wasn't really anyone to call. My boyfriend Caleb had stopped answering consistently during the last month of my pregnancy. Every conversation with him felt rushed, distracted. He blamed work, stress, money problems. Now I was lying in a hospital bed alone while strangers explained why my baby no longer existed. Before leaving, Hayes placed the paperwork closer to me and tapped the signature line with one finger. "We've handled everything necessary." Again, that wording bothered me. Everything necessary, not everything possible. The second they walked out, I looked toward the hallway window in the door. Valerie was still standing there, not moving, just watching the room nervously while Hayes spoke to her in a low voice. Then he handed her the folder marked Live Delivery, and she slid it into a locked cabinet. The next morning, I signed the discharge papers because I didn't know what else to do. Nobody explained the surgery in detail. Nobody offered grief counseling beyond a folded brochure tucked into my belongings. By the time I left St. Mary's Medical Center, it felt less like I was being released and more like I was being cleared out. Valerie walked me downstairs herself. She barely spoke during the elevator ride, but she kept glancing toward the security desk in the lobby like she was worried someone was watching us. I noticed she still carried the same clipboard from my room, pressed tightly against her chest. Right before the elevator doors opened, I asked quietly, "Was he alive when he was born?" She froze. Not for long, just enough. Then the doors slid open and she stepped out without answering. Outside, rain covered the parking lot in a gray haze. My apartment was 20 minutes away, but I sat on the curb for almost an hour before calling a rideshare. My stomach still hurt from the surgery, every bump in the road pulling against the stitches beneath my sweatshirt. When I finally got home, the nursery corner I'd built in my bedroom looked wrong immediately. The crib, the folded blankets, the unopened diapers, everything waiting for someone the hospital claimed had never really had a chance. I tried to grieve the way people expected me to. I stayed inside, ignored calls, slept through most afternoons. But the problem was, grief usually settles around certainty. Mine didn't. Every time I replayed the hospital conversation in my head, small details kept surfacing in the wrong places. Live delivery, 3 missing days, no body, no explanation beyond vague complications. A week later, I opened the plastic belongings bag the hospital had sent home with me. Most of it was ordinary: hair tie, charger cable, lip balm, but at the bottom was the newborn footprint card they'd given me before discharge. At first glance, it looked normal. Then I noticed the ink. The footprints weren't uneven like real newborn prints usually are. They looked too clean, too symmetrical, almost copied. I flipped the card over. The date printed on the back stopped me cold. It was 1 day earlier than the date on my hospital bracelet. I sat there, staring at both items side by side on my kitchen table while my chest tightened slowly. Maybe it was a typo. That's what I told myself first. Hospitals made mistakes all the time. But once the thought entered my head, everything else started connecting to it. I called St. Mary's the next morning, asking for my son's records. The woman in medical records asked for my patient ID, then put me on hold, long enough for me to hear muffled voices in the background. When she came back, her tone had changed completely. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "There doesn't appear to be a file under that name." I frowned. "Under my son's name?" Another pause. "No," she said, "under yours." Something inside me turned cold. I gave her my date of birth, my admission date, my surgeon's name. More typing, more silence. Then, "You may need to come in personally." Before I could ask another question, the line disconnected. Not ended, disconnected. That afternoon, I drove back to St. Mary's for the first time since discharge. The lobby smelled exactly the same: sterile air freshener mixed with coffee from the volunteer kiosk near the entrance. But this time, the second I walked toward the records desk, Nurse Valerie looked up from across the hallway and saw me, and all the color drained out of her face. Valerie started walking toward me immediately, not casually, fast enough that 2 nurses stepping out of the maternity wing moved aside to let her pass. "Blanche," she said under her breath when she reached the records counter, "what are you doing here?" The receptionist glanced between us awkwardly. I could tell Valerie was trying not to cause a scene. "I called for my records," I said. "They said my file doesn't exist." "That's not what they meant." "Then what did they mean?" Valerie opened her mouth, then stopped herself. Up close, she looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, mascara slightly smeared beneath one lash line like she hadn't slept properly in days. "There was an issue with the archives," she said quietly. "Some records were transferred incorrectly after a system update." The explanation came too quickly. I leaned against the counter carefully, still sore from surgery. "So my baby died and somehow all the paperwork disappeared too?" "Please lower your voice." That answer told me more than she realized. Not because of what she said, because of what she didn't. No apology, no correction, no reassurance. Just fear that someone else might hear me asking questions. The receptionist excused herself and disappeared into a back office. Valerie watched her leave, then turned back to me sharply. "You really shouldn't be here right now." The wording hit me immediately. Not, "This isn't a good time." Not, "Come back later." "You shouldn't be here." Before I could press her further, movement near the copier caught my eye. A stack of intake documents sat half-sorted beside the machine, one page slightly separated from the others. At the top corner was my hospital ID number. I recognized it instantly from the bracelet still sitting in my apartment drawer, but the patient name underneath it wasn't mine. Eleanor Voss. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I stepped toward the papers automatically. Valerie noticed too late. "What is that?" I asked. She grabbed the sheet before I could touch it. Her hands were shaking now. "Valerie," I said slowly, "who is Eleanor Voss?" She looked over her shoulder toward the hallway behind us instead of answering. That tiny reaction made my stomach tighten, because people only check hallways when they're afraid of being overheard. "I can explain," she started. "Explain what?" A familiar voice interrupted behind me. "Ms. Carter, Dr. Hayes." I turned and saw him approaching from the maternity corridor, white coat buttoned neatly, expression calm enough to unsettle me immediately. He looked exactly the same as the day he told me my baby died. Controlled. Prepared. Then his eyes landed on the paper in Valerie's hand, and for the first time since I'd met him, his composure slipped, only slightly, but enough. He stopped walking. Valerie lowered the document instinctively like a child caught stealing something. Hayes recovered fast. "Why don't we continue this conversation privately?" I crossed my arms. "Who's Eleanor Voss?" Neither of them answered. The silence stretched too long. Then Hayes placed one hand lightly against the counter and said, very carefully, "Blanche, grief can affect memory in complicated ways." I stared at him. Because suddenly I understood what he was doing. He wasn't explaining the missing records. He was preparing to make me sound unstable. And judging by the way Valerie looked at the floor, this wasn't the first time they'd rehearsed it. Dr. Hayes led me into a consultation room near the maternity wing, the same kind doctors used for difficult conversations. Soft lighting, neutral paintings, chairs positioned too close together so people would feel pressured to sit. I stayed standing. Hayes closed the door behind us while Valerie remained outside in the hallway. Through the narrow glass panel, I could still see her pacing nervously. "Blanche," he said calmly, "I understand you're searching for answers." "You mean records." "You experienced severe trauma during delivery. There's no file under my name. There was a technical issue. And my hospital ID somehow ended up attached to another woman?" That finally interrupted his rhythm, just for a second. Then he folded his hands together and sat down like this was all perfectly reasonable. Eleanor Voss was another patient processed through St. Mary's during the same period. Occasionally, archived records overlap during digital migration. The explanation sounded polished, practiced, too polished. I looked around the office while he spoke, partly because I couldn't stand looking directly at him anymore. That's when I noticed a framed newspaper clipping hanging beside the bookshelf, a charity fundraiser photo. Dr. Hayes stood smiling beside a blonde woman in an ivory dress and a tall man holding a champagne glass. Beneath the picture was a headline: Voss Foundation donates $8 million to St. Mary's Fertility Center. My chest tightened. The blonde woman was Eleanor Voss, older than me by maybe 10 years, expensive jewelry, controlled smile, the kind of woman magazines described as elegant. Hayes noticed where I was looking. "The Voss family has supported this hospital for years," he said evenly. I turned back toward him slowly. "So she's real." "Of course she's real." "Then why is my patient number attached to her records?" His jaw tightened slightly. "You're searching for patterns because you're grieving." There it was again. Not answers, not facts, grief. Like if he repeated the word enough times, it would erase everything else. I left before he could continue. I could feel his eyes following me through the hallway as I walked back toward the elevators. Valerie was gone now, so was the intake document with Eleanor's name on it. By the time I reached the parking garage, my hands were trembling badly enough that I dropped my keys twice. That night, I searched Eleanor Voss online. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Interviews, charity galas, articles about fertility awareness and women's health advocacy. Every photo looked polished down to the smallest detail. Then I started noticing the dates. 9 months ago, Eleanor disappeared from public events completely. No interviews, no appearances, no photographs. 3 months later, she suddenly returned, holding a newborn baby boy. The article headline called him their miracle child. I clicked the photo open wider, and my entire body went cold. Near the baby's left ear was a small crescent-shaped birthmark, exactly like Caleb's.
If the records were only misplaced, then why does the baby connected to Eleanor suddenly shares a feature Blanche already recognizes?
I stared at the screen for so long my laptop dimmed to black. Because birthmarks like that ran in families, and Caleb had vanished almost immediately after I got pregnant. At first, I thought he was immature, scared, overwhelmed. But sitting there alone in my apartment, looking at Eleanor Voss holding that baby, another possibility started taking shape. Not abandonment, arrangement. Then my phone buzzed beside me. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. Hello? For a second, nobody spoke. Then I heard Valerie's voice whisper, "You need to stop asking questions." The line went dead. I barely slept after Valerie's call. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photograph again. Eleanor Voss smiling into a camera while holding a baby, with Caleb's birthmark behind his ear. By morning, I'd convinced myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe I was connecting unrelated details because I wanted something to blame. Maybe Hayes was right about grief twisting memory into suspicion. But the problem was, facts kept pushing back. There was still no death certificate, no funeral home information, no medical report explaining what actually killed my son, just vague phrases and disappearing paperwork. So the next night, I drove back to St. Mary's, not through the main entrance this time. The older maternity wing connected to a basement records annex used for archived files. And during my pregnancy appointments, I'd noticed employees sometimes entered through a side service hallway near the loading dock. That was where I went. Rain hit the concrete hard enough to drown out most sound as I slipped through the partially open delivery entrance. Inside, the lower corridor smelled like bleach and old paper. Half the overhead lights flickered. A janitor, pushing a supply cart, glanced at me briefly. "You're late," he muttered distractedly. I nodded like I belonged there and kept walking before he could look closer. The records annex sat behind a metal security door propped open with a cardboard box. Rows of old file cabinets stretched across the room beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. I started searching maternity archives from the week I gave birth. At first, nothing appeared under my name. Then I checked Eleanor Voss. That was when I found it. My hospital ID number, my admission date, my surgeon, everything filed under Eleanor's archive code. But several pages had been removed. I heard footsteps behind me before I could process the rest. Blanche. Valerie. She stood at the end of the aisle, clutching her cardigan tightly around herself, eyes red like she'd been crying. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "I told them you'd eventually figure it out." My throat tightened. Figure what out? Valerie looked toward the security camera mounted near the ceiling. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she said quietly. "Was my baby alive?" She closed her eyes. That was enough. The room suddenly felt smaller, hotter. I gripped the edge of the filing cabinet to steady myself. Valerie stepped closer, carefully, lowering her voice even more. "Dr. Hayes said you signed consent forms before surgery. He said there was an agreement." "What agreement?" "With the Voss family." The words barely sounded real. I stared at her while pieces of the last few months shifted violently into place. Caleb disappearing, the missing records, the hospital panic, Eleanor's baby. Valerie reached into her bag with shaking hands and pulled out a flash drive. "I copied this after your delivery," she whispered. "I didn't know what to do with it." I took it slowly. "What's on it?" Her eyes filled immediately. Proof. An hour later, I sat in my apartment staring at my laptop screen while the video buffered open from the flash drive. Hospital security footage. Timestamp the night of my surgery. The camera angle showed part of the operating room corridor through a small glass window. I watched nurses moving quickly around equipment. Then Dr. Hayes appeared carrying a newborn wrapped in a blue blanket, alive, crying, my son. My breathing stopped completely. A woman stepped into frame, Eleanor Voss. Hayes placed the baby directly into her arms while I remained unconscious somewhere beyond the operating room doors. Then, another figure entered the video, Caleb. He signed something on a clipboard without hesitation. And before the footage ended, I heard Eleanor ask one quiet question. "She'll never come looking, right?" Hayes answered immediately. "No, we handled everything necessary."
Makes you wonder how many medical complications people stop questioning simply because someone in a white coat suddenly says the conversation is already over, doesn't it?